Hey everybody, it's Eric from epautos.com, your Libertarian car guy. Thought I'd do a quick little chat here about plug-in hybrids, given that I've got this 2018 Mercedes GLC350e hybrid to test drive this week. Plug-ins are interesting. Now, whether they make sense is another matter. They are interesting in the sense that they sort of bridge the gap, if you will, between the pure electric car and the pure internal combustion engine car. The problem with electric cars, well, one of the problems with electric cars is that, of course, their range is relatively limited. Even the best of them, the ones that are touted by Tesla and so on, that can go 200 or 300 miles potentially on a full charge, that's still far, far less than the range that an average IC car can go, which is generally 300-400 miles. Some of them can go a lot farther than that. Some diesels, which have been extinctified thanks to the federal government, could go 700 miles on a full tank. But anyway, the main problem, I think, this is my opinion, is the recharge issue more so than the range issue. If there were a way to quickly recharge batteries such that you didn't have to wait for a minimum of 30 to 45 minutes to get back on the road, I think electric cars might, assuming that they were cost competitive otherwise, might be more than a very, very small percentage of the new car market. They're actually only about 1%, and probably the majority of those purchases have to do with the forced production mandates in states like California, where the preponderance of these electric cars are. And in addition to that, the pressure coming from Washington with regard to the fuel economy mandatory minimums, the CAFE corporate average fuel economy mandatory minimums. Electric cars make sense from the standpoint of a car manufacturer because since they don't burn any gas, when you factor that into your IC engine lineup, it improves your overall fleet average, and that's a big deal for the car companies. But from the point of view of a buyer, the question becomes more nuanced. On the upside of things, a plug-in hybrid like this can go about 20 miles on a full charge, and that's technically very cool. It's neat that you can go 20 miles without the gas engine coming on. And if your trip is less than 20 miles, or you have the ability to plug in when you get there and wait for it to recharge, and then can turn around and drive home on a full charge, you can really cut down your fuel usage. So that's no question a plus. That's in addition to being technologically neat, that's also a plus in terms of economy. Now, it's going to take you a while to recoup your initial investment because these plug-ins are substantially more expensive, not only than the non-plug-in version of whatever the car is, but also than the hybrid version. Regular hybrids are different from plug-ins in that you can't plug them in. They have a smaller battery pack and generally a less powerful electric motor, and they're predominantly IC vehicles. Some of them can limp along for, I don't know, a mile or two or three maybe at very low speed on just the battery and the motor, but generally most of the propulsive force in a conventional hybrid is provided by the gas engine most of the time. Now, the plug-in differs because it can operate as a part-time electric car. However, again, like with the electric cars, pure electric cars, they cost more. You've got a larger battery pack, more powerful motors. In the case of this GLC, it's nearly $8,000 more up front versus an otherwise equivalent GLC300 4MATIC. So you're going to have to drive for a fairly long time before you eat up $8,000 in fuel savings. The main thing that's driving the push for these plug-ins really isn't the urge to save gas. If you look at it at all analytically and logically, the kind of person who is going to be buying a car like this, which is a $40,000 and up car just to start, a premium car, probably isn't too particularly concerned about paying an extra 50 cents or even $1 or $2 more a gallon for gas. Generally speaking, people who are concerned about gas mileage are people at the lower end of the market, people who have less money to spend not just on gas but on the car. It's sort of oxymoronic to spend a fortune on a car in order to save a little bit on fuel. So the main reason, which nobody wants to talk about, it's the emperor's new clothes, it's the automotive PC thing, is that plug-in hybrids are really being adopted on a large scale by the car companies as a way to cope with the burden of the various federal regulations, and not just the ones in this country, but also in other countries, that have to do both with the fuel economy thing and with the emissions thing. In Europe, there are countries where internal combustion, or parts of countries, or areas in some countries, where you're not allowed to drive anything that's burning gas that has an internal combustion engine that's on. But that presents a problem for people who don't have electric cars or who don't particularly want an electric car. So a part-time electric car like this might fit the bill. If you lived in an urban area where you're prohibited from operating on the gas engine, that makes that feasible. And the car companies want to sell cars. They have to figure out how they're going to do that. So the plug-in hybrid is a solution to that problem, but it's all really kind of awkward. It's like trying to figure out how to make a not particularly attractive chick the prom queen, or being nice to the kid with Down syndrome and letting him be the school valedictorian. Not that there's anything wrong with the poor Down syndrome kid, but just looking at it from a standpoint of sanity and logic. And speaking of sanity and logic, while we're on the subject, Mercedes used to offer a BlueTech diesel engine in some of its SUVs, and I've test driven several of those, and they get really good gas mileage. Well, really good fuel mileage, I should say. Frankly, they get better overall mileage than these plug-in hybrids do. I wanted to show you something else about this thing to compare that, to kind of convey the point to you. If you look at the gauge cluster here, you'll see that I'm averaging 24.2 miles per gallon. That's averaging because I'm predominantly using the gas engine during my test drive, and that's because my drive from my place up in the woods down to Roanoke, where I work at the coffee shop, that's about a 35-mile trip one way. So very best case scenario, on a full charge, I can get about 80% of the way down to where I'm going to be, and I can't plug in where I end up. So the way home is entirely or mostly on the gas engine. So overall, probably I'm operating on gas 60% of the time or more, and I'm only averaging 24.2 miles per gallon. And the BlueTech diesel could easily do that, did better than that, cost less than the hybrid does. Unfortunately, you can't get it anymore. And don't blame Mercedes, and frankly, don't blame VW either. It's the tragedy of our times, in my opinion, that Volkswagen not only got crucified over this nonsense about cheating on the EPA's emissions test, but that they didn't fight it, that they didn't get a really good team of PR people to explain the facts to the public, instead of letting the half-wit, uninformed press parrot these egregious, nonsensical statements about 40 times the allowable maximum and choking the air, all of which is absolute nonsense. If you want to look into this and find out the facts, here they are in brief and in general. The cheating diesels would have been fully compliant with all the smog laws in effect in the early 2000s. The difference is that the EPA kicked up the standards by a slight amount. Internally, these things are referred to as tiers and bins, and the difference between one tier and bin is, at this point, fractional. You're not talking about whole numbers. You're not talking about lots of stuff coming out of the tailpipe. They have almost eliminated the harmful stuff coming out of the tailpipe, and now they are just scraping the bottom of the barrel. And what Volkswagen did was to rig their cars with some software to get them through the tests. They emit negligibly, fractionally more of these compounds that are regulated. So because of that, Volkswagen had to pull all of its diesels off the market, and because of the fallout, the PR fallout, other manufacturers are terrified, and they also can't pass, in some cases, the latest, strictest diesel requirements. So we're stuck with these these plug-in hybrids that, again, from a technological and an engineering point of view, they're brilliant. There's no denying. I have great respect for the genius of how they work. The question, though, is, do they make any kind of economic sense? They're really expensive. The real-world fuel economy gains overall are not nearly as impressive as you might think or hope. And all for what? There's this vilification of internal combustion. There's this bum's rush that's coming from above to get away from internal combustion. And why? What's the reason for it? I don't see it. Gas is actually right now less expensive than it was in 1965. There's obviously plenty of gas. If that weren't true, plenty of oil, the prices would go up. I defy anybody to find show me a case in point of a commodity that's scarce and in decline, where the cost of that item is going down rather than up. If there's less of something and everybody knows they're not going to be able to get more of it, the price goes up. That's basic economics 101, supply and demand. So there's plenty of oil, there's plenty of gas. So it all comes back to this cultish obsession with global warming. No, it's worse than that, with climate change, which is something that always gets my back up because of the inherent demagoguery of that term and the dubious quote-unquote science that's behind it. If it were scientific, it would be precise. There would be something you could specifically point to that could be questioned or proved with facts. But what does it mean when you say climate change? It can mean anything. Heck, the climate changed this morning when I got up. The sun rose, it got hotter because the sun is up. And the climate is going to change this afternoon when it rains, and then when the sun goes down tonight, the climate's going to change again because there'll be less solar radiation and the temperature will go down. I'm being somewhat facetious, but I'm also being very serious. Climate changes constantly, every day, every week, every month, every year. It's incredibly dishonest to speak of climate change as some kind of a scientific term. And I find it very revelatory that they had to resort to that term rather than the previous terms, global warming, and before that, global cooling. And they had issues, well, they had a PR issue with both those terms that was embarrassing for them because the data didn't line up with the demagoguery. And they talked about global warming. The problem was they couldn't show that there was consistent global warming, much less that it was the result of human activity. And before that, the thing with the global cooling, we were all going to freeze to death. And again, that didn't work out either. So they came up with this politically contrived climate change stuff, which is very handy and very convenient because every time the climate changes, they can point to it and say, look, climate change. And they can blame it on things like internal combustion and on diesels, and then foist on the public via the manufacturers highly complicated, hugely expensive, and not particularly efficient vehicles. So that's my rant for today. I'll have a detailed review of this GLC350e up on the site, epautos.com, at some point over the next day or two. I just posted something, by the way, about the interesting juxtaposition of the fact that we can't drive any faster today in 2018 than we could back in 1970, despite all of the technical advances and all of the safety features that have been put into cars, which I think is kind of interesting, and you might as well. So please visit the site, have a look at that article, and post your comments, pro or con. I'm not afraid of being taken to task, provided you've got facts to back them up. Don't call me a dick and say that I have bad hair. Assail me for the facts if you can. If I'm wrong, I'll admit it. And that's all I've got to say about that. Thanks for viewing, and we'll catch up with you again soon.